Right.
Wow.
Wow, we're recording, everybody.
It's getting recorded.
It is. And here we are. So we're ready to start. And again, thank you all for joining us from out in remote land and Zoom land. We have a reasonably good group here in at the church. And we're ready to start the presentation for the evening. So today we're going to talk, or tonight, we're going to talk about a rather unusual topic, I would suspect, for many folks, which is repairing cases on small clocks, things like alarm clocks. I remember, I can tell you countless stories of scrounging underneath benches at NAWCC, meets, whatever they might be, chapter or national, whatever, having the owners of the table basically saying to me things like, "Oh yeah, those are alarm clocks. Those are all junk. You can take them all for nothing. I'd just as soon throw them away." Well, it's funny though what happens, when a customer comes to you and says, "I've got this clock that's been in our family for 100 years or 80 years or 60 years. And my grandma, I really loved seeing it on her desk and she's gone now. And I want to see the clock working and maybe even restored to what it looked like when she was looking at it." And, you just don't have the heart to turn her away. And so, over a period of 10 years or so, this sort of story starts to work on you and you decide, well, maybe I better figure out a little bit of how to do this. So that's kind of the origins to this. Well, whether they be alarm clocks or small time only clocks or whatever they are, they present unusual challenges that I think, generally you don't run across. You're working on a cuckoo clock, you're not going to have these issues. Working on a grandfather clock, never see it. But you get somebody's heirloom alarm clock, now you have a concern to deal with. And obviously the broken and the worse the case condition is, the less desirable the piece is and the less it's likely to be put on display. And nobody's going to pay attention to it if it really does look like it came out of a junk box. So, and some of these fully restored clocks, no kidding, will be stunning, and you're going to see that here today. So, well, some of the things you run into is a lot of the parts that were these cases were made out of pot metal. And the best way to describe pot metal is the shop does a cleanup, sweeps the floor, takes all the junk on the floor and puts it into a bucket and melts it down, and now you have pot metal. Now they add a little zinc and a few other things to make the alloy stable, but it's not an alloy per se. It doesn't behave like most of the other metals we know about. So, and they don't age well at all. So bezels on a lot of these alarm clocks are very thin. The clocks were designed to be cheap. They were made low cost. I shouldn't say cheap, low cost. If they were so cheap, then why are they still here after 100 years? So some of them have crackle finishes and that needs to be restored. Some have to be replated with nickel or other metals, maybe copper, maybe brass. Dials are an issue, as I'm sure Jack will testify, having done a few dial touch-ups of his own. He knows the challenges there. So there's no way we're gonna be able to cover all this today as a how-to session. This is gonna be more of a, this is what you can do session. And we're just gonna pick a couple examples for now because we could be here for days. And if you wanna dig deeper, we can talk about other topics later on at some point. If there's enough interest, including movement restorations. And by the way, restoring alarm clock movements is not like restoring a lot of other clocks. So today we're going to talk about pot metal, bezels, crackle finish, and a little bit of plating. That's what we're going to limit it to. So let's get going. So here's our two, I don't know whether to call them host clocks or victims. They look more victimized to me, and they're pretty beat up here. You can see the baby Ben has lost quite a bit of feature in the base. Both clocks have suffered severe drops. Hands are loose, dangling around. Bezels are bent up pretty badly. Dials are, well, you can see for yourself that luminous paint's failing and falling off. And so that, by the way, has to be dealt with very carefully, as you remember from our radium conversation that we had a few months back. So that's what we're starting with today. And by the way, again, both of these clocks, they begged because they had tried to find anybody, someone somewhere that could fix these things, and no one would take them up on it. So having had done this a few times, I felt kind of obliged to help them out. Again, pot metal does not age well. It splits, delaminates, chips, cracks. All those things can be repaired to a point. There are obviously disasters that really are going to be difficult to repair, but many of them can be. So limited delamination can be repaired. And by that, I mean, you see a crack going along the thing and the part is actually growing in size. So it's pretty obvious that something has to be done there. If you have serious delamination where it's just crumbling apart, no. Either go find another similar clock that isn't as bad that you can scarf a part off of, or we can get into recasting, which is a whole different world. So again, front bezels can present some challenges. They get pretty much dented up, and sometimes cracks develop along things like holes for, you've seen the peg leg alarms and the bases, the bottom of the bezel where the peg legs, protrude, the things fall on those legs, as luck would have it, and that tends to bend the material and it ultimately cracks. So we can do crackle. We'll show you how. You can buy products that can help you do that, and the plating actually can be restored too. So surprisingly. So as far as repairing dents and cracks is concerned, the best thing I can tell you is it's just like doing auto body work. You kind of have to create a little bit of a form. You could bend the form up out of 1/8" brass, and you'd be surprised how easy it is to form 1/8" brass that's maybe this big or so. You can bend it around a pipe and get a fairly round and smooth surface, and then you can insert it into the bezel and use it as a background to tap out the dents and cracks or dents and deformations that occur. And it takes a little bit of doing, and never comes out perfect, but it comes that you can get it way better than what you started with almost all the time. So you could even use small punches, such as what you find in a watchmaker's stinking kit, to take out and restore some of the small tight bends that you'll find in these bezels too. As long as you're patient, you take your time. You're not going to get it done in 5 minutes. It's going to take an hour, maybe an hour and a half to get all the problems out of it. So you just got to be patient. The cracks, well, you can see an example there of how you reinforce cracks. The hole there in that top picture, that hole had a pretty substantial crack running right through it. And what you do is you cut a piece of 16 thousandths inch brass. I punch mine out with you can buy these punches at any wholesaler such as MSC Direct, real simple punches, and just knock a piece of brass right out of it. And you use a nut and a bolt to hold it in place, and lay some solder in and let the solder flow in, and it will hold that together forever. So, and corners too. You sometimes see some of these corners will develop breaks, and you may not be able to see it in the picture, but I just took a little L-shaped piece of same brass, 16 thousandths brass, forced it into that broken edge, and flowed solder into it. Do a neat job. You gotta get the solder to flow. It has to flow thoroughly, or you got a bad repair. So other than that, it's not such a tough thing to do. And then another trick is you can clean up some of the minor dents and mars that are left over from your work with 320 paper, and you got yourself a smooth bezel ready to paint or plate. Pot metal, a little more tricky. We can actually, there's a myriad of molding materials out there, but we don't have to get too far astray here. You can repair some of these simple corners with readily available products. You got to reinforce it though. You cannot just glob a chunk of glue on the end, it'll fall right out. So we have to create a reinforcement. I've tried soldering. These old pot metal parts, forget it. You can't get any solder to stick to them. It just doesn't work. So we have to find other ways to do it. I know the absolute best solder out there is called Muggy Weld. It's, nothing works like it with pot metal. But generally, when people are trying to repair pot metal, it's off a 50s Chrysler or something, not a, 1900, early 1900 pot metal based on a clock that has pretty much aged and rotted and is not going to accept solder. Once you're done with the little mold jobs, you could do simple priming, sandies, and painting, just like auto body work. Forget replating 100-year-old pot metal. I've tried everything, nothing works. It just doesn't work. I wrote up a process way back when on the Caswell Plating Products website. I don't even follow my own post because I think I had one bezel or one base plate right. After that, I couldn't get it to work again. So it's very dubious. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to repair this Big Ben Deluxe base that we saw in the picture with the cracked. And the first thing we do is, well, I think it works best, and not everybody has access to it, but I sandblast everything and clean it down to rough, like what you see there, a little grainy surface. It grabs much better. And then using a number 72 drill, you create small holes for a wire frame. You'll see it in the next picture much better. And it's just done with a Dremel tool, nothing fancy, no fancy, setup or equipment. You just drill holes with a Dremel tool and then use 24,000 steel wire to create a frame. And I'll show you what in more detail here. You see that. There's the holes on the left. Can everybody see that? Yeah. And then there's the little wire frame that, the holes don't go much more. I say 6 and 8 there. I doubt in real practice, I go much more than a 16. All you got to do is give it some grab and bite. You don't have to go crazy. And you don't want to put the wire in there and start mushing it around because it'll crack that metal. That metal is very brittle. So something else to keep in mind. So sometimes it helps to take the little stubs of that frame and cyanoacrylate glue them. Just a little bit of a bit of glue on a toothpick, just touch the joints, and by capillary action, it sticks, dries, and it holds that frame real well. Now you got a solid base for the next step. So what are we going to use to mold it with? Well, you go out there and you could buy quarts of all kinds of molding materials. Well, we don't need quarts here. We're not going to spend that kind of, and that stuff has a shelf life. So you buy a quart of it, you'll never use it. So it doesn't make any sense to go down. Even cyanoacrylate glue has a shelf life if you buy too much of it. So we don't want to buy gobs of material that we're just going to end up throwing away not too far down the road. So what I found works is a product like, well, frankly, 2P10 is a material that's sold for repairing wood. And it's cyanoacrylate. It's just it has a couple of extra chemicals in it, so it doesn't react with the acids in the wood. And honestly, I've even tried this with JB Weld, JB Quick, and even standard, Gorilla Glue, super glue. Any of them work. It's not real critical. And they all work more or less the same. Well, what do you do? Well, this gets even funnier. So you're thinking, oh, we need some kind of a fancy mold. No, you don't. You take a couple of pieces of sticky back paper. In this case, this is just label material. Bend it over to the right shape and start pouring the glue. Doesn't take anything all that fancy. Doesn't take a whole lot of time. I think you could do this whole repair count in the drilling in an hour, maybe less. So the process here was we just doubled up a thick label material. We folded it back over to create a little bit of a dam. Everything that happens, you can see right there. It's fastened on the top and bent over carefully because you want to have nice angles, but it's not particularly difficult. And then the first step then is to fill. Here, I'll point to it here. Folks won't be able to see it, but in the upper left picture here, you see the first step of the fill, and it's just filled to the bottom of that recess for the felt. The little pieces of felt go in the corner there. And so I just fill up to that first, bottom level there. And then what I'll do is I'll take a piece of a Delrin dowel rod, just a small cutoff, and lay it inside that area where the felt will ultimately go, and use that as a dam so the glue doesn't work its way back and fill up that. That'd be really hard to get that out of that felt recess. If you get glue in there, you have a dog of a time getting it out. And it's a piece of cake to keep it out. You put a little bit of oil on the Delrin and put it in there so that the glue can't stick to it. And then you pour a little bit extra glue in around and you're done. Takes no time. A couple of steps. Now, what exactly is it that we're doing here? Well, just a quick reminder. Sometimes I'll add I don't like using the bare glue because it shrinks like living heck if you just use the glue by itself. And it can a little bit of brittle too. So what I'll do is I'll add like I bought this whole big pile of metal powder, this brass powder, very finely ground, and you can buy it. You can Metal Powders USA. You can literally just go to their website and buy this stuff. It's not expensive. And I'll use a 1/4, 3/4. 1/4 is metal powder, 3/4 is glue, and you're good to go. It gives you a nice, strong, non-shrinking filler. And again, if you really don't want to mess with all that, just get some JB Quick 5-minute. It already has the filler in it. Worked great. Either one, you won't know the difference. There's one difference, which is that you got to let the JB Quick cure for maybe a couple hours, whereas you could start sanding the super glue in 10 minutes or something. It's really quick. So we saw that. Okay, so here's what happens now. We flip it upside down and we just take a piece of sandpaper, 320, and just start working it a little bit. Doesn't take long, and you're flattened down to, because once you get that filler in there, it sands fast. You'd be surprised. And you've got your corner fixed beautifully in a matter of a few minutes. So that's after priming, you can see that there isn't much left there to see that's wrong with that base. Here we put the crackle finish on. We'll talk more about that in a second, but I have looked and looked and looked and looked for a reasonable crackle material, and I finally found one. And this material I used here works, I mean, as advertised every time. And let me show you what left side's the base coat, two-part system, base coat and crackle coat. And on the left, you see the base. You also notice that there's a few defects here and there in that base that I didn't fix. Well, why bother? It's a crackle finish. You'll never see them. And it turned out that you couldn't see them. Here's the material. It's called Montana Gold. The left two are the crackle finish colors, and the right is the base color. Now, I must say, one thing I learned from doing this was that I probably could have used a slightly darker base coat in this project, and it would have turned out a little nicer because it's too bright in the end. Customer loved it, but it bothered me that it was so bright. So if I were to do this again, they have a rainbow of colors to pick from. It's not a problem finding something that, that'll work better than this. If you go down the list of, I think, who was it that, but it was one of the online hobby outlets, has every imaginable color of this stuff. And it is the only thing I've ever found that works. So now we go to our little baby bend, and this one didn't have a crackle, it was a solid finish. This one had 3 defects, and I wasted so much time looking for a replacement base because heck, this 3 breaks. I'm not going to try to fix that. Well, didn't turn out to be the case. It wasn't as bad as I thought. You can see the metal frame on the left. The one on the right was a lot like we just showed you. And there was actually a little sliver off the back that was broken. And guess what? You can drill a hole here, and run that little frame in there. Fill it, and you're done. It wasn't hard at all. I thought it was going to be this big nightmare. It turned out to be simple. And over there, I'm showing you a glimpse of the base. Turned out really well. There's no defects. You can't tell at all that I was ever in there. And then I went and I did it again to another baby bend base a little while later. Same results. So turned out great. System works great. Step aside for a moment and talk about hands and dials. They are a challenge, especially when they're luminous. Getting rid of that radium-based paint. Well, I suggest go back and watch our little episode that we did on the radium hazards. Clean up very carefully, use gloves, wear a mask, and I mean a real mask that prevents particles, like the N95 kinds of masks, those sorts of things, the good ones. And clean up your area when you're done real well with gloves and a wet paper towel or something. Make sure there aren't any scraps of radium laying around. It's really easy for one of those to fall on the floor, and then you don't know where it is or what it's going to do, or when you're going to encounter it next, or if it's going to stick to your socks and end up in the kitchen. Who knows? So just be real careful there. So what I usually do to get the junk off the dial, because it sometimes sticks still, is put it in a plastic bag and poke at the numbers with a little dulled. I don't know. I thought maybe you could even use like a Q-tip, but I usually just use a toothpick that's dulled down. try to work that material. If it stays, it stays, and you just paint over it. But usually if it's gonna come off, it's falling off, so that's not hard, you just gotta catch it. And then seal up the bag and dispose of it. If you're doing 1 clock a year, I don't think anybody cares if you put it in the garbage. If you're doing 20 clocks a day, you better get a license for dealing with radioactive materials and talk to people about how to dispose of it properly. But I think very few of us are doing that level of, restoration of radium materials, so it's probably not too big a deal. To replace it, I know that there's Luminova is out there. I've had a real hard time finding it. To me, it's just unobtainium half the time. So I found another material I like, which is lit. It's about 1/10 the price of Luminova, and I don't know, for my money, it works pretty darn good. It comes in powder form. It's non-radioactive, obviously. And what I find works well, and there's two trains of thought on this, but this is a water-based lacquer that you see at the bottom there. It's kind of like an acrylic coat, and you mix it up with the lit right when you're ready to put it on, and you brush it on, it flows out beautifully. It's the only luminous material I've ever found that flows out. If you buy the stuff pre-mixed, you can't, it's just lumpy and you can't get it to flow out. This is the only way I've ever found that gets it to flow out. I've talked to Jack, he says he uses an oil-based or alkyd-based finish, and that gives more working time. I think that's really a great idea if you're painting numbers. Little secret here is I don't repaint the numbers. If somebody asks me to repaint the numbers, I'll take a look at using Jack's method, because then that would give me flow out with the numbers. With this, it would dry too fast. It takes too much time to do those numbers at that level of, I'm not a radium girl, so I can't put it on like they used to put it on there. And so I'm just real slow doing it. And so I need something that's gonna keep its workability through that whole process. I haven't tried it yet, but that's my sense that would work. So here's the results. Here's our little baby Ben disaster. You can see on the left what we started with and what we ended up with on the right. So makes a huge difference when the clock looks great, and it works great too. You get the movements to work. The Big Ben turned out pretty well too. Folks were just thrilled with it. Quite a transformation. I told them that I could use the blue, but the blue was too deep. The green seemed to do much better in terms of being similar to what the clocks were painted originally, so they're happy with that. So they took the green. I have both, but the blue's just real dark. Some folks might say, well, I don't care, I'll use blue, but they actually like the idea of the green better. So now we transition to a little bit about nickel plating now. As you all probably know, there were just tons of clocks that were nickel plated that were produced in the early to mid 1900s and even the late 1800s. And what happens is that original plating, from whatever cause, it could just be age, could be finger oils, it could be perhaps inappropriate prep early on when the things were early days of plating. Gosh, they produced how many thousands of these clocks a day? Sooner or later, there's going to be a little prep that doesn't go well. And I've had clocks that were, as found, in absolute perfect condition where the nickel was flawless, and others that are just rotted to pieces. So, the range on this is just incredible, and it really should be a huge surprise. But either way, these things actually can be restored like new, perhaps better than new. But you got to be able to sandblast to remove the old plating and the rust from the steel. You cannot plate over rust. It doesn't work, and never will. And you certainly can't plate over the original plating. Now, there's a real misconception out there that to plate something, you just dunk it in the plating solution and then take it out in an hour, and it just beautiful, just magically levels out and looks great. Well, that's farthest thing from the truth you ever heard, because the plating you put on top is going to reflect right through to what's under it. And so if you don't have a good, perfect surface to start with, you're not going to have a good plate when you're done. So surface prep here is pretty much everything. So what you want to do first is you don't want to plate directly over the steel, because steel does not sand well, it doesn't buff well, it doesn't do anything well except rust. So what you'll do is you'll put a couple coats of copper on first, and then you'll use the copper like you would an auto body primer to fill very, very small indentations and irregularities, not major ones. So what I do sometimes is I'll put a coat of copper on, and then use solder to fill in big blobs or blotches, sand down the solder flush, and then plate it again with copper, maybe twice, an hour at a time, and lap in between with paper. And then finally buff that copper. That buffer does beautiful things to copper. Copper buffs up nice. So it's a great base for prep. So yeah, and you can see little keys and things down there too. I was telling Dick over dinner about tumbling parts. I'm not a big fan of it. I used to do it. It's hugely time consuming and embeds tumbling medium into places you can't get out. And so I've abandoned tumbling. And yet you can still get really good results without tumbling. So some fun facts about nickel. So some you might not realize some of the background is there was a Paris doctor that meaning doctor, a PhD doctor, not doctor who was MD. And this individual did quite a bit of study on the chemistry of plating and came out with the early patents for a neutral pH nickel ammonium sulfate solution. It must have been pretty cool that you could actually put pretty much anything in there and it wouldn't corrode, it would just plate. And he held the patents from 1869 to 1886 or so. But then right after those patents expire, you see a lot of nickel going on a lot of things. And beyond that, then you see innovations such as the addition of boric acid and nickel chlorides being added into the whole science as well. And those changes ultimately culminated in the Oliver P. Watts nickel plating process that is the basis of what we do today too. I mean, the formula that Watts came up with is virtually the same formula we use today in plating, professional plating, big shops and everything. So, so today's nickel is basically nickel chloride, about 8 to 16 ounces, nickel sulfate, roughly 2 to 3 times that, and boric acid, almost you might say a tincture of boric acid that keeps the pH under control. And between those 3 ingredients, and today we have modern additives to nickel plating, which actually help with leveling and brightening too. And those are enormously helpful because it makes the net process a little bit higher yield so that if production folks are using this thing, parts come out consistently without having to muck around with the formula. And I use them too. I use the levelers. They were fantastic. They're like a miracle. What I have found as far as maintenance is concerned is I have these little tanks. Some of you have seen them. I've had those tanks for going on 10 years and they virtually never need any maintenance. You got to use distilled water. You got to keep them covered and clean. Other than that, the only thing I maintain is I've changed the electrodes because they rot. Obviously, they're supposed to rot because the nickel ions from the electrodes get into the solution during the current flow that happens in the plating process. And so they're going to rot. You want them to. And then you have to make bags for these things that are real simple. You just use nylon stockings and cover them up and you're in business. It's not hard. And so the only real maintenance is adding more distilled water because it evaporates because you warm the solution, and the brighteners and wetters, which tend to go. You can use quite a bit of brightener in a weekend's worth of plating. It's probably over a quart of brightener because it does wear out pretty quick. It's an organic and it tends to wear out. It's not, none of this stuff is really very, even the nickel isn't all that hazardous, but one of the things you have to tell yourself is you're going to do this at home, you put nothing down the drain. That's your leading, if you will, guide to keeping the environment and yourself safe. You just don't dump anything ever. And you can recycle the rinse. You can literally do with a little container with distilled water. You rinse the part, then you can put it underwater because there's nothing left on it after you rinse it. Then you dump that right back in the tank, and you just keep going because it's always clean. So there is absolutely no reason for anything to go down the drain in these processes ever. And that's the same as the shops do too. They maintain that same kind of discipline. Tanks operate at about 125 to 135, so there's not a huge amount of temperature there. 60 milliamps per square foot works pretty well as a target. You can go up, you can go down, still works pretty good. And you got to agitate the heck out of it with air, as you can see there on the right, to keep bubbles from forming on the part, which then result in voids and defects on the surface. So, agitation kind of takes care of the majority of that. So that's the fun facts. Here's some more steps. Surface prep, obviously. Cleaning. The one thing I'll say about cleaning, you got to use a professional product for cleaning. You cannot get away from it. I tried everything. Nothing works. Clock cleaning solution will get off the buffing compound and the general dirt, but at least films behind. And you cannot plate over those films. So you got to get the live bed. It's a sodium hydroxide and Na2SO3, I believe, are the two components. FE Clean 125 is a great product. I mean, I've got more than I'll ever use it for anybody ever wants to play. You just got to wear gloves. You got to put eye shields on because the dust it gets in your eyes is going to hurt. I've had it happen. It burns. So you want to really protect yourself from that stuff. But once you mix it up, it's not anywhere near as hazardous. But when it's in its powder form, it could be pretty nasty to your. I mean, it's lye. What do you think about lye? It's going to do. It's one side you say, well, lye is the basis of soap, and the other ingredients that are used are pretty much the same ingredients used in soap as well. But you don't want to dump that stuff on your body. There's another process step called pickling, which basically is generally an acid of some kind that burns off all the residual oxides. Even going through cleaning, you could be left with some oxides. You burn that off with the pickling, and those acids are pretty tame. Except the only way you can pickle nickel if you're going to replate it is with battery acid. Now you got to be careful. And I have a little tiny container about this big, less than a quart, for nickel replating small parts, setter screws, things like that, but not big parts. You really cannot replate big nickel parts. You can't do it. You're just better off stripping it and start over. So, and then of course, one very important test is after you've rinsed it, you have to achieve what's called a water break, which is you have to be able to look at the part after you've rinsed it, and the part has to be completely covered in water film. It's not breaking and having clear spots. It has to be completely covered in water. And it'll happen if you clean it right. And that's the key. At that point, you're ready to play. If you don't achieve it, back in the cleaner until you do achieve it. So, and of course, rinsing between steps. If it's just the soap, the cleaner is not too bad. Little that goes down the drain. That's no more than having dishwashing soap for the most part because so little of it is left. But the last step has to be distilled water because that's what's going to end up getting dragged into the tank, and you don't want, your faucet water to go in the tank. So again, nothing goes down the drain. You protect your eyes and skin, and you keep this as far away as possible from kids and locked up. And since we don't have any kids in the house, it's not a problem. So you got to think about that if you're going to try this stuff. So here's some examples of some plating projects. This was a early 1900s Darsh. Battery clock, strangely, it has a little alarm on it, a little buzzer and a bell and a light that flashes, and it's a pretty cool little clock. I'll show you the front. Some of you may have seen these things, but when they're refinished up, they are gorgeous. They're a sight to see. Some more. Here's an example of a style 4 1930s Big Ben, front and back. This clock was a train wreck when it came in, and once you redo it, it becomes a collector's item. Here's always one of my favorite clocks was the 1941 Ingram 8-day broadcast. These are really 8-day clocks. They actually keep pretty good time too if they're cleaned up and they work properly. They're really great clocks, and they're gorgeous once they're restored, as you can see there. And I think lastly here is a 1920s style 1 Big Ben peg leg. This is the version of the style 1 that you can't get the legs off because they're riveted on. The newer ones, the 1As, then they could screw the legs on and off. These are fun to restore because you got to grind off the rivets, and then you put the legs in the lathe, tap the legs for a screw, which you'll put in later when it's all done. So there's a little work there, but when they're done, they're well worth it. So here's a whole sea of restored parts. This is from my library. I don't think I've done that many parts in probably over 12 years. But now here and there, I do one here, one there. not a lot, but I raised my prices and scared a lot of people away. But I mean, when you look at it, you're consuming materials, you got to maintain things and stay clean, and it's not as cheap as it looks. I mean, it looks cheap, but turns out, yeah, it costs something. So that's the way it is. Any questions, any thoughts? Short and sweet.
So again, the pot metal, can you go over that again a little bit? I've got an Ansonia
Mhm.
and one of the corners is cracked.
Is it painted or plated?
I think it's plated.
You can do a faux plate on it. I can tell you how to do that, but you'll never plate it. You'll never get it to plate. So you're gonna have to fix it like we talked about here. You want to go back through that? You
Yeah,
said
right.
real
I
quick.
know it's cracked, but it's not separated.
So again, what you do, I mean, we talked about the most important thing here is create a frame. And you drill little holes, you put wire in them, and the holes, 24, that's it, 20, yeah,
The part's not missing yet. I mean.
it's still there,
It's still there.
but it's
still-
broken.
Well, it's cracked
Yeah.
and it hasn't come apart,
Is it loose?
but it's loose.
I don't know what to tell you with that. You're probably gonna have to remove it and rebuild it because you can't refasten it.
And then
It's
there's
just
the
not gonna
problem
stay.
of trying to get the same kind of patina on it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we can talk later about how to do the faux plate, but you're never gonna plate it. It's just not gonna happen.
Okay.
So not that I know. If anybody else knows how to do it, please let me know. But I've tried everything. I mean, everything, and nothing works. Not with this metal. You could do it with a 50s Chrysler door handle, but you can't do anything with this 100-year-old pot metal. Now, I have thought about trying to coat with a conductive paint. I actually did it once and it didn't work. And then I heard that there are graphite materials. And I actually have some, I haven't tried them yet. But the problem I have is that most copper processes that are used for this sort of thing, like people plate plants. And they put this graphite on and then they mix up an acid copper. My copper is not acid, it's alkaline. It is not cyanide, it's alkaline. It's a product, again, from, I have to remember what the name is, but it's a product from Epi. Caswell carries it too, and it's wonderful for plating pretty much anything except pot metal. They say it's supposed to plate pot metal, but does not work on this stuff. So there's really not much I can do because the alkaline solution eats the paint. So if I went to an acid bath, I might do it, but I don't want any more baths. So if anybody wants to play around, they want to mess with making up their own acid bath, go for it, but I'm not doing it. I got enough baths. I don't need any more. So I can't, as a result, I can't really do it today. Yes.
When you get a problem such as you just described here, have you thought of going to the Denver Museum of Art? They've got professional restorers there for advice.
Sure, you could. If you're gonna pay something. Not hard to do yourself.
Well, oh, no, I just watched you give it a lecture and by the time I finished, it would look like I have finished.
Yeah, I mean, you could always send it out. I guess I don't know.
Not send it out, you can get advice from, those guys do this for a living,
Yeah.
full time.
Maybe.
And they can fix almost anything, broken pottery, anything.
Yeah. No, I agree. There's probably people out there know more than I do about this. I'll not definitely give you
the
that.
Denver Museum of Art, I would think, because they have to
Yeah.
restore valuable stuff.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go check them out.
You can check them out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take what's in there and understand.
The thing is, it's not broken yet. And
That's fine.
if it's left alone, you don't even
Yeah.
know it's cracked. But if you pick up this particular clock and you're hanging on to that corner of the clock,
It'll break.
it's gonna break. Yeah.
Well, you could try a cyanoacrylate. The problem is, unless you can get a dead clean surface, that cyanoacrylate is going to have hard time sticking to it. So, because you don't realize how much, embedded skin oil and other contaminants have found their way into that crack over the years. And you go to put glue in there and nothing else will hold it. So I have tried this on material without sandblasting, it doesn't work. Once you sandblast it, it sticks beautifully. That roughened surface makes a big difference. Even though the frame is much of what holds it together. And those frame, you can put a little spot of super glue at each one of those exit points on that frame. And now it's not going anywhere. I mean, you could literally pick it up by that corner later and it won't break. So, but without the frame, yeah, forget it, won't stay. It's no more than what you have now. So,
Do you have spare parts, boxes and boxes of spare parts? Because there's a guy in Tulsa who runs a top repair business and school. When I was there, he had boxes of all sorts of parts and milk jugs.
you know what the problem is? The problem is, you know how many versions of these clocks there are out there? I mean, nobody is going to have boxes of every version of every
Well,
clock.
I got a clock which, where is he? Where's he's gone home? I had a broken clock, and he had a clock like exactly the same broken. So I gave it to him, and he took it to have it fixed. Oh, you, that's
Yeah.
right. Now, it so happened that a couple of years back, there was this big sale of somebody who had millions of clock parts. And I've got a whole box of that clock. And I'm sure that if somebody was qualified, you could easily get 2 or 3 of those working clocks. They're the fantastic alarm clocks, which
Yeah.
have a whole lot of holes on top, and you move a lever.
Right.
And it does all.
Yeah,
sorts of
well, some of these, yeah. No, I understand. The other problem with pop metal though is that it doesn't
No.
matter what box it's been sitting in, it's gonna be
Yeah.
rotted.
I'm not talking-
By the
I'm talking
time you
about
get to
actual clocks.
Yeah.
And so if I, you can take his clock or my version of it and make at least 3 clocks.
Well, I had several boxes of screw machine peg legs for these various alarm clocks made up at one point. I got tons of those, but cases, I used to have tons of cases, but I mean, through various moves and so forth, I think we've kind of thinned out a little bit.
What about the movements, bits and pieces of it?
No, you can restore the movements.
Yeah.
Pretty much, there's nothing on the movements that can't be fixed.
Oh, good news.
That's not-
See you with my box.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem again, though, is you buy a box of junk, you take the movement. I've done this. You get the movement, you go through all the trouble of taking the movement apart. Now you got this big pile of parts for one part you need, and it's bad. The same part that's bad on your clock is bad on all of them.
Oh,
It really stinks, you know? So it's kind of disappointing after going through all the trouble of getting the part out to find out it's just as bad as what you got.
But it's a really beautiful book.
Yeah, they are. I agree with you there. They really are beautiful. That's why I think they're worth repairing. And maybe not to everybody, but to a customer it's an heirloom, it's worth repairing. I've also had a little bit of luck, and I found a couple of people that have gone out and have castings made of these things and produced some quantity of them out of brass, like these bases. But all of a sudden, one day they decide they don't want to do it again, and all they have is 8 left. So you get the 8, and you're like thrilled. So what happens when you run out? Well, you're right back again to the same thing. So there's no supply chain for any of these things. I mean, you can get a little bit, bits and pieces of spare parts here and there, but you don't have a supply chain. If you get enough of these clocks in over a course of time, you're going to run out of anything you have. So yeah, it's a pain. But this maybe offers some hope towards repairing some of those.
I don't know if anybody saw the Antique Roadshow. I think it was last week, and someone brought in a collection of clocks that look like this, and they had about 8 or 10 of them. They're the beautiful, what do you call that, enamel?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some of them were green, some of them were yellow. They were, there's a whole set, but they were just beautiful. And the guy, let's see, he appraised them that, I don't know if I wrote that down, but they were really nice because they were so colorful. They were like a little, about the size of a small carriage clock, and they had the beautiful color front enamel, blue, pink, lavender, all in a row. So there's some like that that are collectible. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, and it's funny thing about those is many of them have very simple New Haven or Waterbury fit up movements in them,
Yeah,
and they're all worn out, but they can be repaired. I mean, that's the good news, is they can all be properly repaired and brought back to working condition again. Which is, the movements are never the problem. That's the easy part. It's the cases that they give you the fits. All right. Any other questions? And dials, yes, dials too. Dials can be tough sometimes. Yes.
What do you do about celluloid or plastic pieces of cloth?
Yes, I've had celluloid crystals just come in little bits and pieces because they just deteriorate to nothing. Some of those you can dig around and find glass replacements for the celluloid crystal. Yeah, the cases, you could fix Bakelite often, so you can't even tell you were in there. But it depends on the plastic. Sometimes they just deteriorate to nothing, and then you got a problem. Fortunately, I very, very rarely see those sorts of issues, because there's nothing left of the clock to send me. So it tends to, self-select a little bit. But if there's enough of it there to send, you can usually do something with it. Any other good questions?
or some of those paper dials.
In this case,
One on
they're
the
all
left,
paper
is that a
dials.
paper dial?
They're all paper.
All paper dial, yeah.
All is paper.
I had an Ansonia, might have been one he had, it belonged to my ex-wife's grandparents, and the paper dial was all sort of messed up. But
Yeah,
John Hathcock had bought a collection of baby band clocks,
yeah.
and so I had him put a paper dial that looked better than mine, and he switched it over and really looked nice and was much more presentable.
For Baby Ben and Big Ben's, Bill's Clockworks, on his site, he actually sells replacement dials for Big Bens and Baby Bens, the white ones. They're really good. I mean, the resolution and detail is as good as the originals. You'd have to look at it under a microscope to tell the difference. They don't have it. He doesn't do luminous. You'd have to get really good at painting the luminous, but if you just want, black and white, non-luminous, he's got tremendously nice dials if you ever get stuck on one of those. These dials were repairable, but I've also had situations where I have a dial that nobody has, and the customer wants the dial improved. So if you can't, I've done simple things like you take an eraser to the oil spot. Sometimes you can move that oil, move most of it out, doesn't look bad again. Sometimes the dials are just trashed from years of oil stains, water stains. And now I wanted to do a thing, but we didn't do it, but I wanted to do a thing on using software to restore dials. You can actually replicate dials in software. And I've done a few of those, and it's a ton of work. It takes long because you have to work on small sections of the dial at the time with a mouse and a click, and I'll show you sometime, but you can get tremendously nice results too that way. And then you print it out on the right kind of paper stock and cut it and paste it on, and got a clock looking as good as it did when it came off the factory floor again. So lots of things you can do if you want to take the time and be patient. But that's the thing. You gotta have the time, be patient, and the customer has to be willing to pay for it. Because you can't do this. You do this enough, and you can't do it as a charity. At some point, somebody has to compensate you for your time. But it's fun. It's also very rewarding to see the results. So. All right, we wrap up. All right, thank you all. Your patience. All right, everyone out there, we're going to wrap it now. David, you can kill the recording if you'd like. Thanks. All right, everyone. Is there any questions from the audience remote here? Didn't hear anybody.
Oh,
Okay. All right, everyone, we're going to sign off then.
thanks, Ken.
All right, thank you guys. Appreciate your being with us tonight.
Thanks, Ken.
Okay,
Yep,
take,
thanks.
bye now.